Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our SPIA alumni reception, which we are administering remotely today. Well, I'm delighted to introduce you shortly to our guest speaker, Admiral James Stavridis. First, I thought I'd just share a couple pointers about this evening's event, which is co-sponsored by the School of Public and International Affairs and the School of Public and International Affairs Center for International Trade and Security. This is a webinar, so the chat function is disabled and we can't see you, but if you have questions during the chat, during the talk, please submit those using the Q&A function. After the remarks by the Admiral, Justin Conrad, who's the director of the center, will come on to the screen and he will moderate and he will send forward questions to the Admiral to pose. So we look forward to that. But with that, let me introduce Admiral James Stavridis. He's the operating executive at the private equity firm, the Carlyle Group, where he focuses on geopolitical and national issues. He knows quite a bit about both. Admiral Stavridis served as the 12th Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, a retired 4-star officer in the U.S. Navy. He led the NATO Alliance in global operations from 2009 to 2013 as Supreme Allied Commander. He also served as Commander of U.S. Southern Command with responsibility for all military operations in Latin America. Admiral Stavridis holds more than 50 medals, including 28 from foreign nations. In 2016, he was vetted for Vice President by Hillary Clinton and subsequently invited to Trump Tower to discuss a cabinet position in the Trump administration. Admiral Stavridis is a monthly columnist for Time Magazine and chief international security analyst for NBC News. He's also author of 9 books, including the 2019 monograph, Sailing True North. However, I'd like to read a passage from his 8th book, Sea Power: The History and Geopolitics of the World's Oceans, because it's a good way to get us in the mood for this evening's remarks on geopolitics from someone with sea coursing through his veins. And he actually reminds us in his 9th book that all of us have seawater in our veins. The Sea, Admiral Stavridis writes, as a geopolitical entity, exerts an enormous influence on how global events unfold. From the high tension of the South China Sea, to the cocaine smuggling of the Caribbean, to the piracy off the coasts of Africa, to the unfortunate reemergence of a new Cold War in the Greenland-Iceland United Kingdom gap in the North Atlantic. Some observers may not be interested in the geopolitics of the oceans, but they will haunt our policy and our choices in this turbulent 21st century. The oceans will matter deeply to every aspect of the human endeavor. It's a pleasure to introduce Admiral James Stavridis.
Wow, thank you, Dean Auer, my fellow dean from my days as dean at the Fletcher School. Let me begin by bringing up a couple of images I'm going to show, and there we go. So I'm going to share those. So here we go. I'm going to talk about geopolitics and leadership in the time of coronavirus. So we're going to bring the oceans in a bit, but really we're going to talk about how this international order will change and what kind of leadership we need as we sail these kind of uncharted seas. Let me start with a photograph here that you would immediately resonate to, and you might be forgiven if you think that photograph was taken in Central Park 5 or 6 months ago, one of those pop-up hospitals by the Department of Defense. Nope, this photograph was taken over 100 years ago. It is a photograph of Spanish influenza, which, by the way, didn't start in Spain. It actually began in the central United States and came to the country, to Europe, with U.S. troops. I put it here to kind of remind us that we've been here before. We've dealt with these challenges, and we will surmount what's coming in the time ahead. And even more recently than Spanish influenza, we've gone through Ebola. That's Ebola at the top. Upper right is patient 0 who died in a Dallas hospital. We beat Ebola. We prevented it from becoming a true pandemic. At the bottom is Zika. We continue to deal with the effect of Zika. The point is, every 100 to 200 years in human history, a pandemic stalks us, and this one is no exception. The challenge in addressing COVID is pretty well articulated in this graphic. As you can see, that block is still not quite determined where COVID is going to land. Along the bottom is transmissibility. The further to the right, the faster transmission occurs. Measles, all the way to the right. You look at another person if you have measles, metaphorically speaking, and they're going to catch it. Common cold, fairly transmissible. Where is COVID going to land? Somewhere in that block. And on the left axis is lethality. At the very top, bird flu, MERS, Ebola, these kill almost everyone who contracts them. SARS, quite deadly. Spanish flu killed about 20% of the people who contract it. I suspect we're going to find that COVID will settle somewhere around 1 to 3% in lethality, again, compared to 20% with Spanish flu, and somewhere in the range of 30% of all of humanity infected before this is over. So very transmissible, hopefully not as lethal. So when you kind of roll all that together, you have to ask yourself, what will the world look like as we get through this current pandemic from a geopolitical perspective? What do you think, Admiral? And let me start by showing you what I think is not going to happen. We're not headed to this. I don't know if you've seen this movie. It's not Brad Pitt's finest work, but it's a film and a novel, and by the way, a pretty good novel on the right by Max Brooks, about a pandemic. Happens to be a zombie pandemic, but the principles are the same. As more and more people are infected, what happens? In World War Z, the planet breaks down, civil order breaks down. We're not headed there, but we are clearly going to come through a period of winners and losers geopolitically. So let's take a snapshot thinking about, as we emerge from the pandemic, who are some of the winners geopolitically? Top of the list is going to be China. And this is because China has handled the virus very well. Granted, they have authoritarian tools that we don't have. They just had we would think of it as a tiny breakout, a couple of dozen people infected in a city in Western China. They shut the city and immediately tested 4.5 million people. No one goes in, no one goes out. We don't have those tools. We don't have a system that can provide them. But China has handled this very well using those tools. And I have to credit President Xi with strong, centralized leadership. I put Secretary Pompeo here because if you want to understand the dynamics of the U.S.-China relationship coming out of COVID, you should look at the speech he gave at the Nixon Library about 8 weeks ago. Just Google Pompeo Nixon Library speech. It'll pop right up. It shows an increasing period of tension between the U.S. and China, which I think, unfortunately, is accurate. The reason these tensions are going to continue to rise is that, here's a term we've come to know well, because of the pre-existing conditions we have in our relationship with China. Upper left, we have a shadowy cyber war in progress. Upper right, China is growing its military capability. Today, China, not the United States, has the largest naval fleet in the world of capital ships. They're not remotely as capable as ours, but numbers have a real quality of their own. Bottom right, trade and tariff imbalance is well known as an irritant. Bottom left, you may not recognize. That's an artificial island. China is building these artificial islands all around the South China Sea in order to claim that massive body of water as territorial seas. It's a preposterous claim under international law in the sense that it's huge. It's the size of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea combined. Can you imagine the United States simply claiming those waters? China does. They have a narrative of historical exploration. It's been rejected in the international courts. It is a significant irritant to a nation like ours, which believes in freedom of the high seas. And of course, in the center, I put 5G, the controversy about tech and who will drive tech as it unfolds in this 21st century. These are all underlying conditions of tension that existed before we get to a COVID vaccine. China has a strategy. It's a good one. It's smart. It's called One Belt, One Road. It's a geoeconomic and diplomatic strategy with a little bit of military thrown in along the way. The bottom pincer is that maritime route you see, and that top in red, the old Marco Polo Silk Road. This is where China wants to move goods out, finished products, and they want to bring raw materials in. It's a clever, well thought out strategy which looks 2 decades into the future. Some of the tools they're using to execute it include creation of a cyber force, very capable. And I'll give you a practical example of how good China's cyber force is. Look at the airplane on the top. It's a jet fighter. That's the F-35 Lightning, also known as the Joint Strike Fighter. It is a 5th generation fighter, the most capable combat aircraft ever to take to the sky. Look at the bottom. That's a Chinese J-22. As you can see, it looks exactly like the U.S. F-35. Why? Because the stealth characteristics of that F-35 were in fact hacked, brought back to China, and incorporated into that jet. So this shadow war in cyber and the intellectual property theft associated with it are part of the tools of China's strategy. I mentioned the South China Sea. Let me again give you an idea of the scale of it. Look at it. It stretches from the Philippine Islands to the coast of Vietnam, from the shores of China down to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei. Vast body of water. China wants it because 40% of the world's trade passes through it, and because it's full of hydrocarbons, oil, natural gas. It's a significant part of this One Belt, One Road strategy. I mentioned these artificial islands. China's built 9 of them so far, most of them in that red circle, upper left. At the bottom, you see what a finished one looks like. It's got an airstrip. It's got missiles to defend it. It has tanks and troops and rockets on it. And in the Navy, the U.S. Navy, we have another name for these artificial islands. We call them unsinkable aircraft carriers. They will be part of China's strategy if, God forbid, we end up in a combat situation in this part of the world. I hope we don't. I don't predict that we will, but there are challenges ahead. And lastly, on this Chinese strategy coming out of COVID, watch for China and Russia to draw closer and closer together. Bottom left, that's a photograph taken after the largest military exercises in the world after the Cold War, which occurred 2 years ago on the Siberian border between Russian and Chinese troops who are hugging each other at the end of the exercises. And bottom right, that's a Chinese destroyer and a Russian frigate. And they're operating together. Not in the North Pacific, where you might kind of expect that. That photograph was taken in the Baltic Sea, in the heart of Europe. So China and Russia are drawing closer together. That too is part of China's strategy. It will accelerate coming out of COVID. And all of this ought to concern us. I think there are sort of 2 futures for the U.S.-China relationship. This is a Chinese warship on a goodwill visit. The visit is to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Look closely, upper left on the screen, you see the U.S. flag flying there, typical of a naval warship of any nation. When you enter another nation's port, you fly the flag of that nation. We could create a positive relationship with China. There are many incentives that drive us to do so. On the other hand, we could have an inadvertent incident, I would say at any time, but probably 10 to 15 years from now, that could spark a conflict. Upper right is a novel that I've written coming out in the year of the title, 2034. The subtitle is A Novel of the Next World War. It's a cautionary tale. We need to pay attention to China, especially as we make this turn out of COVID. They are feeling strong. Let's take a look at Europe coming out of COVID. First of all, I think, unfortunately, Brexit will be done. I didn't support the idea of Brexit. These are decisions for Europeans to make, obviously, but it's a reality. And as the United Kingdom withdraws, we'll see Europe spend more time and have more attention to pay on larger geopolitical issues going forward. There's good leadership in the European Union right now. It's led by a woman named Ursula von der Leyen, who I got to know well. She's the president of the European Union. When I was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, she was the defense minister of Germany. She's poised, smart, a terrific leader, a physician. She is leading Europe very effectively. And I think Europe will make the turn out of COVID neutral or stronger, although, as we all are observing at this moment, a second wave is hitting Europe. Europe handled the first wave better than the United States. I suspect they will handle the second wave better than the United States. But their challenges are not yet over. Overall, Europe coming out of COVID, I think, comes out neutral to stronger geopolitically. Here's where I'm really worried. It's the emerging markets. That's India at the top. That's the Golden Temple of Amritsar. The bottom is a photograph taken in Pakistan. This represents South Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa is likewise at risk, as is Latin America and the Caribbean. All three of these regions, which are home to 2 to 3 billion people, are at risk because their medical systems are not well developed. Their systems of governance vary widely in their ability to marshal the tools of containing COVID. And above all, they simply don't have the resources to throw at the problem the way East Asia has done very effectively and the way Europe and the United States have done poorly, but at least we have the resources. On the plus side, the populations in all three places, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, are young. So we're going to see a massive experiment, if you will, in herd immunity. We'll see how that comes out. In a better, more perfect geopolitical world, the United States and China would work together to take the lead in manufacturing a vaccine and distributing it for both humanitarian reasons and pragmatic reasons, because these markets are vital, both for the United States and for China. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. We're going to have to monitor that emerging market segment closely. We ought to be concerned about it. How about Russia? Russia is a nation under significant stress. Demographically, its population is being reduced about 1 million per year. Its economy is a one-trick pony, kind of a two-trick pony, I guess, oil and gas. And it's got centralized leadership, but still a kind of a spirit of determination and independence that makes it hard to bring about the mask wearing that we see done so effectively in Asia. So I think Russia will come out diminished, not only because of its underlying conditions, but also because of the challenges it faces in its governance. It will continue to be a spoiler in international relations, and I think increasingly will be co-opted by China as part of China's One Belt, One Road. How about these two nations? Perennial difficulties in the international system. At the top, of course, is Iran. Those are Iranian high-speed boats in the Arabian Gulf. At the bottom, North Korea. By the way, in case you're worried about North Korea, Kim said recently there have been 0 cases of COVID in North Korea. I think not. We need to recognize that these are two nations that are under stress from COVID. They do have authoritarian tools, more so in North Korea than in Iran. Both will be somewhat reduced in their engagement capability, but both are going to want to come out of the blocks hard after the U.S. election. Both have been relatively quiet for about 6 to 8 months, combination of COVID and waiting for election results. Look for both of them to reemerge, punching as usual above their weight in ways that are very negative for the international system. So that's kind of a snapshot of how the world does coming out of this. How about here? Well, unfortunately, I think U.S. geopolitically will come out diminished as a result of COVID. First of all, because of our mishandling of the virus, the high level of deaths, the difficulty we've had convincing our population to do what it needs to do. There are many reasons for this. To some degree, this will be adjudicated a week from tonight. But the point is the U.S. influence, regardless of whether we have a Biden 1 or a Trump 2, we will come out diminished. Our economy will be damaged and our reputation damaged. And it's largely the result of this, of gridlock. And by the way, I need to say at this point, I'm a political centrist. I'm a registered independent, always have been. I was vetted for vice president by Hillary Clinton, one of 6 people actually vetted fully by the campaign, and I was offered a cabinet post by Donald Trump. I kind of think of that as 2 bullets whizzing by my head. My point is, I'm a centrist and I'm worried about the gridlock in our country where we've managed to turn the act of wearing a mask or not into a political statement. It is not, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. By the way, that adorable little girl in the bottom left, proudly wearing her Minnie Mouse mask, is my granddaughter, Lorelei. She's 4 years old. She knows to wear a mask. This will be adjudicated not only in the polls, it'll also eventually be subject to a thorough investigation. What has happened, and more importantly, how can we do better next time? Because there are more pandemics coming. We had a 9/11 commission after 9/11 where we lost 3,000 lives. We had a Pearl Harbor commission after we lost 2,000 lives. We will investigate this. We will learn. And again, it needs to be apolitical, bipartisan, looking factually at what has been done well, and some things have been done well, and what has been done poorly, and some things have been done poorly. And at what level have things been done well and poorly? Federal, state, local. We need to draw those lessons. We need to investigate them without fear or favor. What worries me about all of this is a sense that, are we going to decide that we just need to disengage from the world? I think that would be a mistake. It's what we did 100 years ago after Spanish influenza. Upper left, we pull back from the world. We build trade barriers, the Hawley Smoot tariffs. How did that all work out? Well, you can drop a plumb line to the Great Depression, upper right, and to the rise of fascism, bottom right, and the Second World War. We're going to need to stay engaged in the world, as painful and difficult and messy as it all is. And again, whether it's Trump 2 or Biden 1, the right prescription coming out of COVID is for us to continue to engage in the world. And with that thought, I'd like to conclude by talking for a moment about some tools of leadership that can be applied, I think, globally for the United States as we turn to the era that's coming after COVID. And here, I want to just call your attention to arguably the greatest of American presidents, certainly in the top three, along with Washington and Lincoln, FDR. He faced challenges that frankly dwarf the challenges we face today. Not only Spanish influenza and the aftermath of that, the trade barriers, the Great Depression, the Second World War, the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's a pretty full plate. If you haven't really focused on FDR, read a biography of him. I recommend Gene Edward Smith's FDR. He was a team builder. He was calm and steady. He was a terrific communicator in an era when a tweet was something that a bird said, and the cloud was actually in the sky. There was no internet. There was no television. He captivated and inspired the nation through a series of fireside chats using those most primitive of radio mechanisms. But he got his message across. He was also someone who could keep things in perspective. And he was, and this is little known about Roosevelt, a master of detail. He could name not only every state and every capital and every governor. That was child's play. Roosevelt knew the name of every county in the United States. There are 3,000 counties. He knew the county seats. He knew the county commissioners. He knew the Democratic Party chair in each county. He was a master of detail. So if you look at that basket of qualities and you map that against world leaders, I think unfortunately there's no world leader that really achieves the FDR standard. There are some good ones and there are some pieces and parts out there. Upper left, you probably don't recognize Ursula von der Leyen. She's the president of the European Union, a entity of 500 million people, a democracy and our closest partner in the world. She has some of those skills. President Xi is a forceful, direct leader. He's a master of detail. He's a strong communicator. Someone like Bill Gates represents the private sector and what it can bring to the table. Upper right, you may not recognize her. She's the leader of a tiny nation of 5 million people called New Zealand. That's Jacinda Ardern, and she is conquered this disease twice. Shinzo Abe just left office, but his policies in Japan have been extraordinary. So big democracy, many of the challenges that we face, but managed to handle this pretty well. Angela Merkel, I think, has done reasonably well. India, that's Narendra Modi, jury's out with a large and difficult to manage population. Bottom right, the leader of the World Health Organization. The point here is that the leadership tools of somebody like an FDR very seldom come together in a single person. So we ought to be thinking about them in the context of some of these individual tools of leadership and how they can apply. Top of my list is innovation, the ability to think about change, the ability to deal with accelerating change. And innovation can be as small as a Post-it, can be as massive as a moonshot. It can be as crazy as the idea of putting airplanes on a ship. Think about that for a minute in 1925. Innovation is going to be the heart of what we need. And a lot of the innovation we're seeing today, of course, is in the world of biology, tied to our increasing ability to sequence the human genome, our ability to test rapidly, to create a vaccine. But we are going to see these innovations coming out of this COVID experience drive into geopolitics and military innovations. They're already picking up substantially, even as we are dealing with COVID. And frankly, the most significant innovations may be these sociological changes from at the top, telemedicine. Do you really want to go and read old magazines in the doctor's office if you don't have to? On the right, something University of Georgia is experimenting with very effectively, teleeducation. That trend, already extant, will get a significant bump coming out of this. And bottom left, I guess what we could call the Tubin rule, keep your shorts on, but that kind of connection using the mechanisms we're using today, I think all of these are trends that are going to continue into the future and are going to be significant innovations. Second tool, communication. We've talked about FDR, his ability to communicate using very primitive means comparatively. Here's the problem with most communicators today. They think of communication, bottom left, as a megaphone. The louder they shout, the more effective it is. That's not how communication works. Communication is a bridge, right? It goes both ways, has two sides to a conversation. We need leaders who are capable of communicative kinds of mechanisms in creating communication strategies. And in that regard, we all have to get effective in this world. Now you're looking at that and you're thinking, okay, Admiral Stavridis, those are probably shipping lanes. No. Okay, are they airline routes? No. Are they fiber optic cables under the ocean? No, there's way too many. Only 280 cables carry the entire internet. So what is this? This is Facebook. The world according to Facebook. The brighter the white, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. The tell, if you're a poker player, is that China is dark because China controls all of their data in their social networks. Communicators not only need to understand it's a bridge that goes back and forth, but we've got to be able to move communications at scale and not lose the personal touch that's critical. When I was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, I spent a lot of time with the Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces, my counterpart. For all that we can do in this socially networked, highly scaled model, personal contact still trumps everything. You need both. So innovation and communication. Third and final tool, collaboration, teamwork. I thought a lot about what image to put here, and I started with a picture of a rowing shell from the Olympics, 8 guys all rowing together. And I realized, as perfect as that is, as synchronized as that is, that's not what collaboration actually looks like in the real world. I think it looks more like this, a peloton. These young ladies are in a bicycle peloton, and they are drafting on each other. They're in mini teams. They're competing, but they're kind of collaborating at the same time. It's messy. People fall down. That's what real collaboration looks like. And, even in something that looks quite formal like NATO, I will tell you, if you have to convince the Bulgarian foreign minister to walk along with the defense minister of Iceland to increase the troops going to Afghanistan on behalf of the NATO Alliance, hey, that's a peloton at best. It's not 8 guys rowing all together in a shell. Collaboration is messy, and if you understand that, you know why collaboration in the real world in geopolitics looks more like this. Not a formal alliance like NATO. It is a coalition. This is the coalition against the Islamic State. 77 nations are in this, including good old NATO countries, but also our allies in the Pacific. You see Australia and New Zealand. Arab countries. You see Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Coalitions are going to be part of that messy collaboration. And as I always say, where's the NATO to deal with pandemics? We need to think about international alliances and coalitions to deal with pandemics, to deal with climate change and the other key issues we face. Well, as I wrap up, I'll address a quick point that many who are studying there at SPIA are focused on. You're learning about the international organizations, the UN, the European Union, NATO, the World Bank, World Health Organization. You know, it's tempting to think of them like these old Chevys in Havana. You know, they were built in the 50s. They kind of look old-fashioned. They run on gasoline. Yet, I think it's too soon to say, let's just get rid of them. Let's just drive them into the Havana Bay and start over and build some new ones. I don't think so. I think what we need to do is think about these international organizations as still on the road, still effective. We probably need to give them a paint job. We probably need to improve them. It'd be nice if they ran on something, maybe a renewable fuel source, to mix my metaphor slightly. But the point is, there's a role for this kind of collaboration in the world going forward. All of it, everything I've talked about, has to rest on values. What are our values? Democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of education, gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute them imperfectly, admittedly, but they are the right values, and they must undergird all of our efforts as we deal with the pandemic and as we move forward. All of this is hard. And by the way, I'm Greek American, so I'm required to have a Greek myth in all my presentations. Here it is, that's Sisyphus. All of this, particularly here I speak to the students and the alums of SPIA, the international world is hard. That boulder is going to roll back down. The key to anybody is resilience and putting your shoulder again and again to that boulder. And we better do it pretty quickly. We better do it at speed. And by the way, it's tempting to look at that cheetah, the fastest thing on earth, and say, wow, that's really fast. And it is. And look at the body of a cheetah. It's got a very narrow head that cuts the air in front of it aerodynamically. Got powerful front legs, big lungs to process all that oxygen, huge back legs to drive and accelerate. Whoops. Wait a minute. Look at the tail of the cheetah. If you were creating something to be the fastest animal on earth, which a cheetah is, it can go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. If you were creating that by evolution or creation, take your pick, why would you give it a huge tail? Why doesn't it have like a little bunny tail, no drag, or no tail? The answer is, and I'm sure the engineers in the crowd know this, it needs that tail for balance, because as it accelerates and then tries to turn to change, if it didn't have that tail for balance, it would just go tumbling into the jungle. So the point is, all of our efforts, all of our work have to be done at speed, but we have to keep the system in balance at the same time. Last picture. I love this picture. It was taken about 4 or 5 years ago. It's on a beach on the Red Sea. These are Somali migrants. Prosaically, what's happening in this picture? Well, they're holding up their cell phones. They're trying to get a better signal. Metaphorically, what's happening here? These are migrants. They are on the long trek. This is a photograph of their hope. They are hoping to get to the next stage of their journey. This is part of the international world. My point for us is that hope matters and is a more powerful force than fear, a more powerful force than any other I can think of. So I'll close with a quote from Napoleon. I love to quote Napoleon because I'm about his height. And short people have to stick together at all times. Napoleon said, a leader is a dealer in hope. A leader is a dealer in hope. If you remember nothing else from our evening together, remember that line. A leader is a dealer in hope. Therein lies the solution to the challenges we face today in so many ways. Thank you very much. Pleasure being with you. I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over for some questions and comments.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Admiral. Good evening, everybody. If you have a question for the Admiral, you can go ahead and enter it in that Q&A window there. We have a lot of good questions, so I will get to those in just a second. But I had a question for you. You have a relatively new book out, Sailing True North. I see a copy of it there behind you on the desk.
Shameless self-promotion.
It's a fantastic book. And as you might guess from the Admiral's presentation, it's a lot about world history and naval history and international relations. But more importantly, it's about character and leadership. And, one thing that you talk about in there is how we often don't think of it this way, but how vision is really an aspect of not only leadership, but character.
Yeah.
You talk about Admiral Grace Hopper and how, she, essentially said that we should, instead of thinking in terms of a few weeks out or a few months out or a few years, we should really be thinking 100 years in advance. That's part of having vision. That's part of what a leader should have. My question is, how as a leader, how do you maintain that kind of vision? How do you maintain that kind of long-term eye on the ball, particularly in times like these, which seem so uncertain, in the sense that we don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow? How do you maintain that long-term vision?
Yeah, I think for every leader, whether you are in charge of 3 people on a team at Google, like my daughter Christina in her late 20s, or you're the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in charge of 2 million people from 28 different nations, you have to maintain a sense of vision. And I believe that is part of character, because maintaining that requires self-confidence. It requires a willingness to be wrong, maybe most importantly. And third, I think that vision requires the ability to prioritize. I think all 3 of those things are central to what leaders have to do. And all of this ties back to innovation, Justin. And as you look at the 10 admirals in Sailing True North, all of them, to one degree or another, had vision, but not all of them brought those 3 qualities together to have the fundamentally the courage to try something new, knowing that it might and would often fail. And to come back from that failure is that act of real character. So not only am I a huge fan of Grace Hopper, the 10th Admiral in that book, whom I actually met when I was a young midshipman at the Naval Academy, first learning how to code in Fortran in BASIC using punch cards. That's a little snapshot of the fact that I'm 1.2 million years old. But I met Grace Hopper, and she was then in her 70s and just crackling with energy and talking constantly about try new things and innovate and don't be afraid to fail. This was in the late 1970s, before all that became so fashionable in so many aspects. We didn't have a tech industry in 1970. There was no Silicon Valley. So Grace Hopper, I think, is the right one to put a finger on. And the other one I would mention, just because I think few people will have heard of him, and he was such an enormous character, almost exactly 100 years ago, during the period of time we've discussed a couple times tonight, was Sir Jackie Fisher. And he came into the Royal Navy in the age of sail. And by the time he left, these wooden ships and their sails, the Royal Navy was all steel, on hydrocarbon propulsion, on oil, black oil, was firing long-range rifled cannon using optical sights, had submarines, had torpedoes. Think about the scope of what he saw, and he drove much of it himself. Much of it occurred toward the latter days of his career. And I'll close on this point by saying one of my favorite Jackie Fisher lines as the money was squeezing out in the pre-World War I era, he said, now that the money's run out, we all must learn to think. And I suspect there's some validity in that, pretty much in every industry, certainly in the defense world. And it's a pretty good tagline for what we're going to face coming out of this COVID period as well. We've got to think our way out of this.
Great, thank you. We'll turn to some questions from the audience. It looks like we've got a lot of folks who are interested in U.S.-China relations. So let's read a couple of these. Let's see. Regarding U.S.-China relations, the U.S. appears to have given up on a policy of constructive competition and engagement. If so, what replaces it?
Yeah, this is a good summary for the shorthand of what should we do. And I'll give you my prescription for U.S.-China relations. Number one, before we leap to decide what we should do, we had to step back and study China more. I think China understands the United States much better than the United States understands China. We need to learn more about China. We need to study the scholarship. If you haven't read Henry Kissinger's magisterial volume on China, start there. There's a lot more to go. And by the way, we ought to be encouraging programs to learn Mandarin. We ought to have exchange programs between our universities. We simply need to learn more about China. And by the way, I say that because this is all very personal to me, in that my daughter, Christina, whom I mentioned a moment ago, works at Google. Her husband is Dr. Jimmy Wang, first generation Chinese American, parents born in China. My little granddaughter, Lily Wang, is part of the future of U.S.-China relations. We have got to get this right. So once we get past the let's learn more and understand China, and by the way, let's tap that Chinese American community to help us understand China. Next, we need a defined national strategy for dealing with China. And the way we ought to do that, in my view, is we ought to have a commission that ought to come together, led by someone like Henry Kissinger, with the top scientists, the top technologists, the top military minds, the top medical minds. We ought to bring together all of business and finance. We ought to bring together leaders who understand China as well as any American can, and task them to give us a national strategy for dealing with China. We have done this on multiple other occasions, including dealing with the national debt, dealing with the 9/11 disaster, dealing with tech. We need a national strategy for China. And here's my prescription for what it ought to say in shorthand. And I think this is where it would land. It ought to be a strategy that says we will confront where we must, we'll cooperate wherever we can. So we should confront China on claims to the South China Sea. Those are insupportable under international law. We should confront China on the treatment of Uyghurs in their own nation. We should confront China on their intellectual property theft. But there are so many zones of cooperation we can pursue. Strategic arms limitation talks, climate control. We're never going to solve climate without bringing the US and China together. The Arctic and the high north. China has a highly vested interest in those trade routes. That's a potential zone of cooperation. Medical diplomacy, humanitarian operations. Both nations operate very sophisticated hospital ships. Let's send them together in a flotilla after the next tsunami. I could go on, you get the point. We should confront where we must, cooperate where we can, have a plan, have a strategy, and for God's sake, let's work harder to understand China in this unfolding 21st century.
Great, and we've actually got a question more on the confrontation part of that. Somebody in the audience asks, is the Ronald Reagan carrier strike group sufficient to check Chinese aggression in the South China Sea? If not, to what extent can the U.S. adequately compete in the region with the Chinese Navy?
Yeah, this is a sophisticated question, and I thank you for it. The good news is the U.S. has the most capable naval forces in the world. We, as I mentioned in my presentation, are not numerically superior to the Chinese Navy, but our forces are vastly more capable in every dimension of warfare on the seas and in our ability to attack land targets from the sea. So we typically move a carrier strike group through the Taiwan Strait into the South China Sea, and then we add to that individual missions by single US Navy destroyers, all going through these waters to show that we believe these are international high seas. International law, and this is what my own PhD is in, international law is determined not by a Congress that passes international law. It's determined largely by the practice of nations, added to treaties, added to customary international law, and so forth. So it's important that we conduct these missions. The Ronald Reagan Strike Group is conducting a freedom of navigation, a presence mission. If we, again, God forbid, get into a situation where we need to apply combat power in the South China Sea, I assure you the Ronald Reagan will be joined by multiple carrier strike groups, by our nuclear submarine force, which is unmatched in its stealth capabilities, by our Air Force operating long-range strike aircraft from U.S. territories and from bases of our allies in the region. Our U.S. Marine Corps will be involved in special operations. Without sketching for you the entire plan to conduct combat operations, I'll close by saying we are ready to fight tonight, as the saying goes. What we need to avoid is the necessity to do so. That will require diplomacy, economics, having a plan, understanding China.
Great. We also have several people are interested in the role of Turkey in NATO in the future. And one person in particular asked about the recent tests of the Russian S-400 system. So what are your thoughts on Turkey's role going forward in that alliance?
Well, first of all, when I was Supreme Allied Commander for 4 years, Turkey was 100% a positive force in the alliance. They participated in every mission. They had highly professional troops in Afghanistan, in the Balkans. They sent ships and planes on the Libyan mission. They were part of the counter-piracy mission. They hosted one of the major commands. I would give them an A as a member of NATO in terms of participation and engagement with the alliance. I left the alliance, I left command of NATO in 2013, so 7 years ago, roughly. In those 7 years, Turkey has become more challenging within the NATO alliance. And now I would not characterize their engagement as an A. I'd say it's trended downward because of taking positions that run contrary to those of other NATO allies. Turkey is in confrontation with Greece in the Aegean Sea. They're in confrontation with French warships in the southern central Mediterranean who are trying to enforce an arms blockade on Libya, appropriately so. They have become more problematic in the alliance. So the question, as always, is, so what should we do, Admiral? What's our move? I would say we're still at a point where we ought to be criticizing in private. We ought to send high-level delegations. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs ought to be going to Ankara. We ought to send the leaders of NATO, the Secretary General, the Chairman of the NATO Military Committee, the current Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. They ought to be going and engaging with our Turkish colleagues. We ought to have effectively confidence-building measures about Turkish engagement on NATO missions. As the questioner correctly points out, Turkey most damagingly has purchased a Russian air defense system called the S-400, very advanced system. That's problematic for NATO because if you connect it via the Turkish air defense system to the NATO air defense system, it reveals all of NATO air defenses to a Russian system, We don't know what kind of backdoors are in that system. Therefore, that is quite problematic. So specifically on the S-400, because the questioner asked about it, we need to create a working group at the technical level to try and resolve how we can block off that S-400 system so it doesn't connect back to the rest of NATO air defense. That's a technical problem. The rest of the challenges, which I detailed, need to be handled still behind closed doors. Bottom line, Turkey is still a valued member of the alliance. It would be a geopolitical mistake of epic proportion for the alliance to push Turkey away. We need to continue to try to pull them back.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. And I apologize to everyone. There's a lot of good questions here. I apologize we won't be able to get to everybody's, but I'd like to take it back to leadership. We have a question from an audience member. It says, Admiral Stavridis, you have talked about how important it is for leaders to provide hope for those they govern. In the increased state of political polarization that we are in, how do you see leaders providing hope and appealing to their bases simultaneously?
Yeah, we need to, for starters, we need to beat the word base out of our politics. That's not helping us in any dimension. And here I'm talking to you, whether you are a Fox News, every morning you're with the folks on the white couch and you can't imagine an evening where you haven't heard from Sean Hannity, or you're an MSNBC and you are Morning Joe in the morning, and by the end of the night, you can't wait to hear what Rachel Maddow is going to take on. I'm talking to you. We need to get away from this idea of the base. It is hurting us badly. I'll give you 3 ideas, and there are many others out there, but 3 ways we can start to address the schisms that we have discovered and unfortunately have been highlighted in recent times here. Number 1, we can celebrate the idea of service. Celebrate the idea of service. A service is bipartisan. Service is nonpartisan. People say to me all the time, Admiral, thank you for your service. That means a lot to me. We say it to the military, but here's an important point. There are so many ways to serve this country. How about our police, our firemen, our EMTs, our diplomats, our Peace Corps volunteers, Teach for America, Volunteer for America, educators. You think a school teacher in rural Georgia teaching a packed classroom for $34,000 a year, that's her starting salary. Think she's serving the country? I do. Nurses in inner city clinics, you get the point. There are so many ways to serve the country. We ought to celebrate those acts of service. We ought to encourage them. We ought to incentivize them in our tax codes. And we ought to just simply thank people. I appreciate it when people say to a military member, thank you for your service. Go thank a teacher. Thank an EMT. Thank a nurse on the last shift working in a COVID-packed hospital. There are a lot of ways to serve the country. We ought to celebrate that. Number 2, it's education. It is teaching our children about this magnificent idea that is America, that doesn't know about base. And by the way, newsflash, take a look at the Constitution. The words Republican and Democrat do not appear in the Constitution. We've had a lot of political parties in this country. We've had Whigs, Federalists, Progressives, the Bull Moose Party of Teddy Roosevelt, Ross Perot's party. We've had a lot of parties in this country. And frankly, as we go forward, I would say we're due for a re-examination of whether these 2 parties and that system are serving us well. Education will help us understand and put all that into perspective. Important word. And as a subset of that, our children need to learn how to deal with the internet. We've done a poor job of teaching them how to discern fact from fiction on the internet. And there are tactics, techniques, and procedures to do exactly that. That needs to be part of primary school education as well as for all of us. So number 2 is education. And number 3, and this is probably a good one to close on a week from the ballot, it's voting. It is owning this problem. So often as Americans, we have fallen in love with admiring the problem that is our nation. We own it. In that debate I alluded to a moment ago, the only really significant three-way debate in American history was Bush, Clinton, and H. Ross Perot. H. Ross Perot, by the way, got more votes as a third-party candidate than anybody else in history. At one point, Perot turned to the camera and said, "You," he had that kind of squeaky Texas voice. He said, "You, America, you're the owners of this country. Start acting like an owner." And what he meant by that was elect people who are going to, my view, reach across those aisles, who are willing to step away from the base, who are willing to run on principle, who are willing to argue with all their heart for what they believe in, but at the end of the day, find a path to compromise. There are candidates like that out there. There are governors like that out there right now. We need to, as Americans, in my view, if we want to resolve some of this, we need to apply our own efforts to doing it and stop admiring the problem quite so much and rather seek solutions. So there's three places I would start. Service, the idea of education, and voting. De Tocqueville said, in the end, the tragedy of democracy is that you elect the government you deserve. We can elect a government we deserve. I believe that with all my heart. Thank you.
Well, we'd like to thank you for your time and your insights tonight. And I think we're all inspired to go out and thank teachers and paramedics and other service members, but I believe everybody here would also like to thank you for your service as well. And I will turn it back over to Dean Auer. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Dr. Conrad. Takeaways briefly, the qualities of leadership that you mentioned: innovation, collaboration, communication, gratitude in your last remarks there, values, balance, resilience, hope, education, service, voting. And I will certainly remember that a leader is a dealer in hope. Thank you for your leadership, Admiral. And with that, I want to thank also our audience and to remind you that we have other events coming up, although this will be a hard one to top. But join us on Wednesday, November 18th at 12 p.m. We have a post-election panel discussion with the AJC political insiders, Jim Galloway, Tia Mitchell, and Greg Bluestein. Check out our events website and you can sign up there. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Admiral, and go Bulldogs.
Go Bulldogs. I'm for you. Bye-bye.